over more than 50 years, Ravi Zacharias established himself as one of the foremost Christian defenders and promoters of the faith. He was the author of more than 30 books, including bestsellers. He was the founder and chairman of a board of a ministry which gained worldwide prominence. He was a frequent presence on Christian TV and radio. He was married for 48 years and had a seemingly stable and happy family life. When he died of cancer in 2020, he was lauded and eulogized by well-known world leaders. But sadly, just months after his passing, following allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse and an investigation by a law firm, his reputation as a godly man of integrity was shattered. If you went to the website of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries afterwards, the main thing you found was an extended statement of apology and regret from the board. This may be one of the more striking recent examples to attract the headlines, but we're all familiar with others, both from famous and much more obscure church leaders. And I would suspect that none of us needs to hear such stories to be reminded of the dangers of hypocrisy. In the field of commerce, laws now demand that the outside of the package tell the truth about what's on the inside. Deceptive packaging is illegal in many countries, and truth in advertising has become a pillar of marketplace morality. But people don't usually carry health warnings, do they? We may be able to read on a pack of cigarettes that smoking causes cancer or heart disease or any number of other serious diseases, but when it comes to the vagaries of human relationships, we usually have to rely on less obvious messages. But as our reading from Ephesians 4 underlines very forcefully this morning, that's not how God wants us to be. In fact, to quote the 3 double L's of my main points today, God calls us to true integrity as we move from being lost in lust through lessons of liberation to living in the light, living in the light. The Apostle Paul can be very blunt about the problems of life without Christ. And verses 17 through 19 provide us with a vivid example. Having given his readers the marvelous picture of Christian unity and diversity, which we read from the first half of chapter 4 last week, Paul begins verse 17 with a strong word of instruction. So I tell you this, he says, and insist on it in the Lord. So he's not offering optional advice here. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. You must no longer live as the Gentiles or pagans do in the futility of their thinking. We need to remember that the apostle is largely addressing a Gentile or non-Jewish readership here. So he's not trying to appeal to their Jewish heritage. Instead, he's contrasting what's expected of his readers now that they have come to Christ with how they used to live. And what did such a lifestyle involve? Well, it's not a pretty picture. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their hearts, Paul says in verse 18 following, having lost all sensitivity, or literally in the original Greek, having become callous, like hardened skin, to the point where they cease to feel pain, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. Anyone who's ever struggled with sin in their lives, and that includes all of us, of course, will know something of what the apostle means here. It's not just a question of what we do, but how we are. When we're blind to the light and dead spiritually to the life of the gospel, our hearts become hardened, and our natural tendency is to go from bad to worse. So however our lives may appear on the outside, whatever our public image may be, we are progressively consumed by what Paul calls a continual lust for more. We become enslaved to the very things that cause us problems. The most obvious examples of such a behavior pattern, of course, are addictions to various substances like drugs or alcohol. But we need only consider all the programs designed to treat other issues in the same way, like unhealthy preoccupations with sex or gambling or greed, to see that sin by its very nature is addictive, as the apostle makes crystal clear in verses 17 through 19. Without Christ, we are all lost in lust, to use his colourful expression, in different ways. And that's why it's so important to turn to him and to learn lessons of liberation, to come to my second main point. There's an old story about a spy who was once captured and sentenced to death by a general in the Persian army. But before execution, the officer went through a rather unusual ritual, because he gave the man a choice between facing a firing squad or going through a big black door. After long deliberation, the spy finally decided on the firing squad. And moments later, he lost his life. So when the general rather casually remarked that they always prefer the known to the unknown, his aide decided to ask his commander exactly what lay behind the big black door. Freedom, the officer replied, and I've only known a few brave enough to take it. Freedom, and I've only known a few brave enough to take it. Anyone who's ever been set free from their own problems of addiction will know that it can take more courage to quit than to continue in them. But Paul reminds us in verses 20 through 24 that Christ can make all the difference. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way, the apostle says in verse 20, by which he means the way of sin and death. And then he recalls the major lessons of liberation that Jesus teaches us all. Pope John Paul II is reported to have said that freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. In one of our wonderful prayers from the Book of Common Prayer morning prayer service this morning, we talk about the one whose service is perfect freedom. And what Christ does is to teach us the way and give us the means to follow through on his teachings. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him according with the truth that is in Jesus, Paul